So you're very welcome today to the first in our series of online talks to coincide with Cartoon Saloon's My Father's Dragon, the exhibition, which runs here at the Butler Gallery until January 29th. So I hope you will check out our website for opening times and information on this talk series for additional talks coming up. I'm Anna O'Sullivan, the director of the Butler Gallery and the curator of the exhibition. I worked with Stephen McNamara of Rogie Design Studio, who was the exhibition designer, who did a beautiful job. For those of you who can, I would encourage you to come visit the exhibition. And for those who cannot, we will have installation images on our website in due course for you to check out. Today's talk is entitled Shared Visions and will run for 1 hour. We're delighted to have the three assistant directors of this very special animated feature with us today. They are Fabian Erlinghauser, Louise Bagnall, and Mark Mullery, and I look forward to an interesting insight into their process. The conversation will be moderated by Amal Rooney, studio manager of Cartoon Saloon. You may post questions in the Q&A throughout the talk, and hopefully we'll have time to pose some of those to the speakers at the end of the talk. I'll now pass you on to Amal Rooney. Many thanks needs to be said to Animation SkillNet for funding this talk series. Many thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here again virtually. Some of you may have joined us for the Wolfwalkers talks, which were, they seem like a long, long time ago now. We had those online because of lockdown, but we chose to run this talk series online because it's a way that we can actually have a much bigger international audience, which I think is a great opportunity. So today we're joined by Fabian, Louise, and Mark. We're going to be talking about the role of assistant directors. And we're also going to ask all three participants a little bit about how they came to be in Cartoon Saloon working as assistant directors, because I think it's always really great to get a sense of the career paths that are possible for people. So Fabian, we might come to you first just to ask, how did you end up sitting in that chair?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point how people come to animation, because first of all, it's such an all-encompassing medium with touching so many different areas. And I have friends who are sculptors, who are painters, who sort of come to that. My first love was actually comics as a kid, and then animation. And yeah, just really briefly, I went to an animation studio in Germany, where I'm from, and everybody there was Irish. Literally everybody was Irish. And these people had just come from the Sullivan Bluth studio in Dublin when they closed their doors. And so they told me about Ireland. I hadn't heard that much about Ireland until that point. I flew over and studied there. And then joined Cartoon Saloon in 2000, a couple of months after the lads set it up. And yeah, so the animation bug had really bitten me, and I supervised. I was animation director on some of the projects, The Breadwinner, Song of the Sea, and Secret of Kells. But then when Dork Van Dango came around, I co-created that show with Nora, and I had been intrigued by directing for a while, and that was sort of an opportunity for me, and I just absolutely love it now, just touching different areas, touching different parts, while also just maintaining that overall vision. So yeah, and all three of us, I guess, then worked on this particular film. I think one interesting, well, I guess what people might wonder is, how can three people coexist on a film and not step on each other's toes? And I don't want to talk for the others, but I think one definite recipe for success was that we didn't need to step on each other's toes, because we divided and conquered in terms of the departments. So Louise would have been involved very early on with storyboards and the world planning, and she's going to talk more about that in a minute. And then I come more from a figurative area, where I would have been involved much more with animation and posing, let's say, and then Mark with layout and so on and so forth. So that, I think, was crucial to also maintain a through line, and to not, to complement each other rather than to be a hindrance to each other.
Fabian, you mentioned there when you were speaking that you'd been an animation director. Can you explain the difference between an animation director and a director of an animation? Because to some people, they might sound like the same thing.
Yeah, it's a good point. No, as animation director, you're more focusing on the performance of the actual characters and the emotions they need to convey in that particular moment, where they are in that particular point in the story, and really looking out for continuity and how the whole performance plays out over several sequences. You often have a huge team of animators on a project, and sometimes these animators come to it cold, or maybe they've just started, or so you need a corrective who says, well, look, that's a lovely piece of animation, but that's not what this character might actually do. And so it's kind of a gatekeeper for the performance and to keep that through line. And then as a director, obviously, yeah, you have a broader vision of the whole project. It's more about keeping the story consistent. You also look at the animation, of course, because that's a huge, crucial part of it. But it starts earlier. You know, you're involved with scripts, you're involved with creating that actual sequence in the first place. And so it's much more about the overall sort of fleshing out of that moment rather than only focusing on performance.
Thank you. And Louise, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that, but I'm just wondering, could you start by telling us how you came to be in Cartoon Saloon as assistant director?
Yeah, so I worked, well, basically I studied animation in Dublin, where I'm from, and I graduated there in 2007. And since then, I worked, before I came to Cartoon Saloon, I actually developed and directed a couple of short films in Dublin, and worked as well as an animator on TV series in Dublin and also over in Germany. So I did a few different things. And then I got a job in Cartoon Saloon in 2013 on Song of the Sea as a posing artist. So that was kind of my route to getting to Cartoon Saloon in the first place, I guess. And I suppose what's interesting about that is that, like, it wasn't that I had a huge amount of experience that was super relevant for when I came to Cartoon Saloon, but I learned as well a lot. I was very interested in the projects the Saloon was making, and I learned a lot as well when I came here. So really what was, I suppose, after that, then I worked in a lot of different roles in the Saloon. So I worked as a posing artist, I worked as a character designer, I worked as a storyboard artist as well. So I worked in these different roles, but the other thing I wanted to do was develop and direct my own material. So short films and TV series and other ideas. And that was something that I was able to also do within the studio, which was fantastic. So I directed a short film. I wrote and directed a short film called Late Afternoon as well in the studio back in 2017. So that was kind of part of my, time that I did these different roles, but I also kind of started to gravitate away from being an animator maybe, and more towards the things that I was more maybe interested in, which is to do with developing and the pre-production side of a lot of the projects that we do. So places where we're thinking about the story a lot, and we're thinking about the character designs, or we're thinking about the locations. So we're looking at like the look of a project and figuring out what that is, and also the story. So that's the kind of areas that I really gravitated towards. And for me as well, then directing a short like Late Afternoon gave me a lot of experience as well. But it still is a very big jump between directing a short film and going on to a feature film as assistant director. So that was also a bit of a jump, but like it's a great kind of like, for me, I had a lot of stepping stones before I got to that point as well. So that's kind of how I came to be assistant director on My Father's Dragon. And a bit like as Fabian was saying, we had our different kind of expertise, I suppose, on the film in terms of where we were most useful as assistant directors. And for me, I think like my experience in the things I'd done, for me, working on the sort of the earlier side of the film, where we were looking at the storyboards, we were looking a lot at the like character designs and locations and things like that. That was more where my kind of experience was. So that was a useful kind of position for me to be in for Nora, I suppose, as well, because assistant directors, I think the job changes depending on your own expertise, but also depending on the project itself, depending on the director. I think there's lots of different ways of being an assistant director, just as there's lots of different ways of being a director. So I think it's really interesting from that point of view as well. I think we all took different aspects of the job and kind of were able to help the project in different ways at the points that we were on. Yeah, that's just
you talk about that pre-production phase.
Yeah.
Really, that's the kind of a fleshing out of the director's vision, like imagining this world that you're going to create. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think, yes, exactly. It's a little bit more specific. So what we're trying to do in pre-production is we're trying to we're trying to answer questions that will enable the production departments, which will be things like the animation of the characters, the background artists, and the later compositors, to be able to, we're trying to provide enough material for them to be able to do their jobs. And a lot of pre-production involves making decisions about what the film will look like, or making decisions about exactly what the story is going to be on the screen. So we're basically trying to answer as much of that as we can before we get into production. Ideally, we answer everything, even though it's hard to figure out what everything will be. But that's what we're trying to do in pre-production. So it involves a lot of back and forth with the director. It involves a lot of, trial and error. It's not a straight line. There's no right answer when you begin. Nobody knows where you're going to end up exactly. So it's also about a little bit of exploring and allowing the style, for example, to develop, to try and think about what works with the story, as well as, like, the two things have to communicate with each other, the design side and also the story side. So as an assistant director, my role is really to try and basically help to facilitate these different departments in terms of, like, making sure that there's information going between these two different departments, but also that the director's vision and the director's insights are also getting passed along, or getting remembered, or getting, like, highlighted. So it's really just allowing there to be a better flow of information. I'm not the only person there who's trying to do that, but it's one of the more kind of important roles, I think, as assistant director at that point.
I do want to point out here as well that I know you all three are award-winning for your work in various ways, but you were nominated for an Oscar for Late Afternoon, which is such a huge
cool. No, it was good. It was very exciting to be nominated for making a short film, which was very rewarding and unexpected a little bit, because you don't make short films for the awards, really. You make them for the passion, I think. But it was a wonderful experience. And it was just understanding how that all went, going through the whole process. A short film, of course, is very different to a feature, but going through the whole process from beginning to end of a project, in a way, it's a great training ground, and it's a great experience to learn what it's like to get a project all the way from written words on a page through to the final, screening at a cinema. And that was, the more times you can do that with shorts, for example, I think the more you understand about your own abilities and about, where your own strengths are. And then that can help inform the next project that you work on. So for me, it was a really important step for myself, but it was also really, I think, useful for me in terms of working on other projects in the future as well.
Some great advice there for aspiring filmmakers. Mark, we'll come to you now. Can you tell us how you ended up in Cartoon Saloon?
Yeah, so I ended up in, same as Louise, I went to IEDT here in Dublin and graduated a couple of years after her. And I had been working in some, I've been working in a couple of other animation studios, notably one with Jeremy Purcell, who is one of our directors in Cartoon Saloon as well. He had a studio in Galway. And what had happened, I came to work as an animator on Song of the Sea in a specialist kind of software that Jeremy was using. But with an eye to staying to work on the TV series, the preschool show Puff and Rock. because we had made a series that was off the same format in Galway, and it, as in the same kind of preschool, same kind of length and everything, same software, and ideally same pipeline, but it had been a lot had gone wrong on it, and we had kind of together hatched this idea of how you could kind of establish a pipeline for that. And so that led to a kind of an interesting arrangement, because I was the compositing supervisor, because compositing was something I was always fairly into. Compositing being the last visual step, the step where everything is layered and put into place, the final picture basically. But being the technical director as well, because I'd done bits of directing in Galway, being the technical director, being the person who kind of establishes how the project is going to get made, it was a really interesting combination of jobs, because the compositing department is often just kind of dealt a lot of material. A lot of material just gets thrown at them, and it's like, please make this make this into a movie or make this into a show. And there was something interesting about kind of having the title of technical director. It was just a little bit of a kind of scepter that you could wield. You could walk into other departments' meetings, into layout meetings, into things like that, and say, well, hang on, please, can you arrange this in this way? Can we think about that way of doing it? You know, there's an analogy with like with chess, where it used to be that everybody learned chess by learning every possible opening strategy, but then there was an alternative school that said, why don't we start with the end game? Why don't we just have these start with these boards where you're already backed into a corner and try to solve it from there, and then work earlier and earlier? And so that was kind of what happened to me in Cartoon Saloon. Was I started with comp, and I started saying, okay, well, how do we wind up in this mess? And then you go back and you fix things to the point that you're up at layout. And layout is something I really, really enjoy. Layouts where you kind of first, it is in a sense just the underdrawing of the background, but it's also where you're establishing the stage for the characters. It's where all the compositions happen. And there's, even though they're at the beginning and the end of the production process, they're kind of bound together in some cosmic way, comp and layout. So that's kind of always seemed quite important. And then using everything I had learned there, I got the chance to be assistant director on Wolfwalkers for Tom and Ross, and that was really amazing, because that was first time kind of working with storyboards, working with the script. And once again, it was just kind of the same thing. It was just thinking about, well, if we thought about this story point here, about this, we could make it work better for the layouts. We make it work better for the layouts. People do better work there, you know, better, and then you have quite an energetic thing by the end. So yeah, it's been the complete backwards process for me, starting from the end, working back to the beginning. Yeah.
And I have a couple of questions to ask you about different terminology that you used, because unlike you three, I didn't study animation, and I didn't end up in Cartoon Saloon through animation knowledge. It was sheer luck. So words like pipeline took me a long time to understand. What are people talking about? Where are the pipes? What pipelines? Can you explain what pipeline is?
Yeah, and so pipeline it's one of those things. I think anything where you're building things, there's a like anything that even has assembly lines and stuff, you might kind of use the term pipeline, and the idea is that you have a established way of making things from beginning to end, so from department to department, and that might seem like really simple and obvious. That might seem like, yeah, of course you do, but it's one thing when it's a short film and it's being made by 5 or 6 friends, because they can all just say, you're good at this, I'll do this, when you're done with that, I'll take it. It's a whole other thing when you have 80 or 90 or 200 people and in 3 countries, in 5 studios in 3 countries, you know. And so it ends up being this it's basically this workflow that says, here's what happens when you know, what does the layout department get? Well, they get a storyboard and they get a briefing, and then what are they supposed to provide to the next department? And then how do they provide it? And how do they name it? And everything like that. And so that's what we mean generally when we say pipeline. You can get very, very specific too. A lot of people tend to use it interchangeably for the software and for the actual like interconnected automatic processes that connect things. But you can have a pipeline without having a pipeline software. You can have a pipeline, you know, a pipeline's almost just an agreement of how you're going to make things. So that's what we mean. And in the very simplest, if you were trying to explain to you know, a 6 or 7 year old, you would just say the pipeline is just how we agreed how we're going to make this film. That's all it means.
That's great.
I wanted to add here that the pipeline on this project was very complex as well, because in previous projects, let's say on Song of the Sea, it would have been more straightforward with a couple of softwares. But here we had a marriage of loads of different softwares, and to have those characters interact was very complex. The trick is to make it look seamless, that all of these marry well, and that you don't see the seams really, you know. But one thing that, like, even though all three of us looked at different departments, there's one really crucial work step that all of us attended, which is the director's kickoff for every sequence. And that's really where Nora would sort of lay out her vision as the main director, really, what she would like to get out of the scene, what the characters should do, how they should react, and so on. And then you have all the different departments on that call, like the heads of departments, and everybody can sort of chip in with concerns, let's say, but also solutions. And, you know, how, like, for instance, how do we deal with this here? You know, who has an idea how we could tackle that in terms of software? So that's a really interesting sort of playground as well, to hear all the departments and to find the best solution. So oftentimes it's also thinking on your feet, like, you know, rather than sticking to a pipeline that is rigid, sometimes we have to also break out of that for the sake of the production and speed things up, or not follow the pipeline just for the sake of it.
And I actually think, I actually think that's in a way where you have a partnership between an assistant director and a technical director, because a technical director's job, generally speaking, is to like establish and maintain that the principle of exactly how this is going to work. But the executing of that, so the director is the one who says what they want to happen, but the actual executing of that tends to be the job of an assistant director through the supervisors. And that kind of, if you're going to say, right, here is the ideal way that this works, and that's what the technical director will say is the pipeline, the assistant director should be the person, if they have a good relationship, should be the person to be able to say, okay, cool, we're pulling the brakes off this, we're skipping that bit, and we're going right to here, and I know that's going to work because of this or whatever, and then together they should be able to get things running in that way. But it's a partnership, I think.
Yeah, and ideally it should always serve the director's vision. You know, we should never be slaves to the software or beholden to a certain rigid sort of system that then compromises the vision or the animation. Like all the way back, like we only had one software at the beginning of Cartoon Saloon. We were only working in Flash and in paper. And, you know, oftentimes that drives decisions then, that drives creative decisions. And now we're in a much better position where we can basically, we have an art direction style that's given, and then we can say, well, what can we use in order to achieve that, rather than the other way around where the software dictates things too much.
Fabian, you mentioned director's kickoff before particular sequences. Is that the norm, or was this specific to Nora's way of doing things?
No, we've done that before. We're doing it now, co-directing a TV show here now, and it's really important to do these things because, yeah, you just have to get stuff out the door, really. You know, that's the reality as well in terms of deadlines. You know, we talk about the creative aspect and the beauty of everything, but there's also hard deadlines that need to be hit. So in a way, in animation, you have to hit the bullseye. Like we put all these milestones in order to prevent, let's say, that we have to claw back several weeks or months. So we're putting these milestones in just so that we don't need to get back to square one, because you have a small enough budget compared to huge studios like and so it's really important to have that, and the more clarity there is from a very early stage, the better. So there's a huge amount of reference material that is being made. For instance, Nora acted out literally every scene in that film, and somewhere there is probably a cut where like the entire film exists only with Nora scenes. But yeah, all of that helps greatly, especially again when you have a team, let's say 60 animators, and all of them have different sensibilities, different tastes, and different approaches how a character should walk or jump or anything like that. So just being on the same page like that is a huge help. And then, as Mark was saying, like there the vision is laid out, and then we go away and see how can we serve that, how can we achieve that. Like, but yeah, it's definitely a stage that that paid off, and we're using it all the time now. So.
Yeah, I think that there's something there, when you're working with a director, you want to try and understand, everybody's trying to work towards their vision, ideally, that we're working towards the same goal, and there's not multiple different sort of goals happening, that you're kind of all trying to work towards one goal. And I think one of the key things to try and, for an assistant director is to try and really understand what the director wants. Listen carefully and ask questions as well to try and clarify when necessary. But then there's also the job of, like, even if the assistant director knows this information, like, how best are they going to communicate it and keep that alive throughout all the different, how are they going to make sure that information carries through in different areas and different departments. So something like the director's intention kickoff was really useful in terms of, like, setting out very clearly what was the intention for each, for example, for each scene, both for, even if it's like, for the background supervisor to hear what the intention was for the animation was even useful, because it gives everybody an understanding of what is the goal of, breaking it down into quite, like, sequence by sequence areas, really what is the goal and what is the director's vision for what comes. So I think it's one of those things where a director, especially when you get into production, their time is very, very precious. So this is also sort of the most efficient way that we have to sort of make sure that there's an overarching voice there, and to make sure that the director's vision gets basically gets touched on for every single sequence, so yeah, it was a really important step.
Yeah, and I think the crucial thing is to not have too many cooks in the end, that we have short ways between what the original vision of that sequence was, that spark that made it look great, that really makes it work. And there's always a danger that once you hand it out to many hands, then it might get watered down. So we always have to be sure of that through line, that through line stays consistent. And so oftentimes, more people doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. So we have to always find that balance of fanning it out to a greater team, yet at the same time retaining that original vision.
I'm going to remind people that we will have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to put your questions into chat now, and then Anna will be able to put them to our panelists. One thing that's becoming really clear from how you're all talking about the role of assistant director is the importance of communications. So that communication with the director initially, and then that communication out to the team. And normally that's taken for granted, maybe, as a very natural part of the process. But MFD was in a very strange situation, I guess, because lockdown happened very soon after production started. So that communication, which is a natural, easy thing, suddenly was no longer natural or easy And I wonder, Mark, could you tell us a little bit about the difficulties and the challenges that had to be surmounted in ensuring that there was good, clear communication and that everyone was on the same page?
Yeah, like, to be honest, in a way, the pandemic and everybody working remotely really just shook the board up a little and then kind of shone a spotlight on things, because I think most organizations and most projects, large projects like making a feature film, you do have to observe that the different means of communication you have are there for different purposes that get mixed up, and they are often kind of misused, and they often lead to inefficiencies and so on. So you often will have some kind of chat software. We used to use Skype. We now use a Google system that's kind of wrapped up with our emails. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, emails are supposed to be for like long form things that you can check in on later and give an answer, but then there's always the fear that somebody else in the thread is going to jump in and say the wrong thing first, so everybody's anxious about that. And then the chat is great because like as in instant messaging is great because you can just check things quickly, but of course that leads to continuous unscheduled prompts, while maybe ideally people would be able to get 2-3 hours of work done on a scene or whatever. You have kind of official comments, and you have people actually in the studio going up and tapping each other on the shoulder. So the truth is, communication, especially if you forget about all these different ways that it works, is one of the things that can kind of make or break the morale of a project in a way. So what the pandemic took away from us, without doubt, is the ability to just go up to somebody's desk and check something with them, and the ability to just, or the happening that you might just see something on someone's computer and go, oh my god, that's brilliant, okay, you know what, we're going to do this, or what, check all that stuff around, or hey guys, gather around. You could say all these things that just seem so normal in a workshop. We couldn't do. We came in at the right time, as in, I think we talked about this, like, what if there was a global pandemic in the 90s? What would work? What would office work? What would it have looked like if everybody had to go home? We don't know. It all happened at a time that this kind of communication that we're doing now was possible. So what we started doing on My Father's Dragon was we made sure that there were kind of catch-ups all the time. There was a catch-up at least every Friday, and frequently more than that, like whole crew catch-ups. And what started off as being a pretty cold list of stats about what department was where very quickly became a little bit more kind of showman but by the end, and there was much more of trying to glide people into the weekend. And also, one thing that was important for us was, when everybody's just sitting at home and working, it's very easy to forget that you have a separate life. Like on Fridays, people used to all just go to the pub or whatever after work. That wasn't happening. So that meeting at the end was almost this way of telling everybody, okay, when this is over, turn off your computers and just go do something else, please. So that's the one thing, is obviously we had a lot of in-person meetings as much as possible. The other thing I would say, the thing that we had anyway, but that almost made it look like there was no difference, was we used this system called ShotGrid, formerly called Shotgun, which is our project management software, but it's specifically geared towards reviewing shots, reviewing things like that. So you get versioning of, hey, I've finished this version of this background, here it is, you upload, there can be comments on the side, there can be replies, you say this is good, this is done, and it can be a little bit more official in that way. And that was the nice thing, was we had built that anyway as a formal communication and review tool, and we had been using it in both internally and with our co-production studios. So we would have had studios at various times, as in partner studios, not belonging to us, partner studios in Denmark, in France, and so on. And we would have tried to make it seamless, that it didn't make a difference whether you were sending a note to somebody who was 2 seats away from you, or you were sending a note to somebody in Denmark, right? It shouldn't be any different. And so that meant when you were at home and you were writing those notes and you were sending it to somebody who was maybe 10 doors down at their kitchen table, it was actually the same system for them. So some things were new, and other things were the ones we, were the original things we had, that maybe let people feel like, okay, it's not really any different. I'm still just getting notes. I'm still just working away. So yeah, if anything, it shook the board a little, and it shone a light on things. Yeah.
This is a really interesting topic, because there's a huge difference between receiving a retake written down, or if somebody's standing at your desk and sandwiches that retake, like, oh yeah, this looks great, but how about this? And so in a way, it's easy to become a victim of a system's efficiency. Whereas if you get a retake in ShotGrid, let's say, and it says, change this and change that, it's reduced to the bare bones of communication. And sometimes, sometimes that can be hard for people during a pandemic, when somebody sits in a room. And let's not forget, this is a really international team, and the people in work are practically their family, right? So, and that makes a huge difference as well. Then just reinstating these sort of water cooler chats makes a huge difference to morale. But on the other hand, we've also retained some of those work methods. Now that we're all back in the studio, we've actually retained some of the stuff that worked well. So it's a whole interesting discussion of what to learn from it, what to take away from it, and what to drop again.
I did think when Mark was speaking that you were talking very much from a technical director's perspective on it. And I wondered, because Louise, you spoke so much about the importance of understanding the director's vision and communicating that, the importance of communication. I was wondering about that more human side that Fabian's referred to, it's taken time. I think it's interesting that we've chosen to do this in a remote format, whereas previously the talk series had to be remote. That was imposed on us. And there are reasons for, I guess, reticence in using it. I'm just wondering about that side of it, that human connection, Louise.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have much choice about how we were going to deal with it. It had to go online, and everybody understood that, and that was what we had to. We just had to jump into that boat. But it is, that there was some advantages to working online in terms of meetings. Everybody was nobody was late for a meeting anymore because we were all just sitting at our desks. But it does, and the meetings sort of start to become quite matter of fact, is what we found. Like, people get straight to the point, and that made them very efficient, which was, in a lot of ways, wasn't a bad thing. But it also meant it was maybe a little harder to understand, to get the bottom of something that might be an ongoing issue. Like, for example, if somebody's finding something challenging, you might be able to, talk about it in person a little bit easier, or that the individual might be able to talk a little bit more openly about, the challenges they faced. Whereas on a call, especially in a large call where you might have a lot of participants, you find that some people weren't maybe communicating as much or speaking up as much. So it took a little while, because we were all trying to figure out what was the best way to work remotely. But I think gradually we started trying to, like, as Mark was saying, find these ways of reconnecting with the team. How do you keep the team morale? How do you make them still feel connected to each other, even if they aren't in the same city anymore? It was challenging, and I don't think it was ideal in that respect, in terms of, like, I'd always prefer to be working in person as much as we can with people, because those things come much more naturally when you are working in person. At least some of the time. It doesn't have to be, it can be hybrid and everything like that. But I think that that was always one of the other things that was probably harder, was trying to keep track of things like, team morale, or if somebody was struggling with something, trying to make sure that they were communicating that issue, because maybe there was a solution that they weren't aware of. So that was really, a lot of that came to the supervisors of each department, and making sure that they were communicating a lot with their team and having a lot of catch-ups, and really just trying to keep them engaged and make sure that they knew that even though they might be on their own in their, you know, bedroom working away, that they actually were on a team and everybody was working together still.
I can remember some of the problem solving that we did. So at one point, like, we delivered 5 scanners out to 5 different artists, and, you know, packs of watercolor paper and paints, where normally those things, you know, there'd be one scanner that everybody used. So definitely having to think on our feet about how we did all of these things. But I also remember a comment coming back around feedback, that it's so easy in person to give feedback because, as Fabian said, you can sandwich it, but also you can reach over and you can draw what you mean on someone's screen, and that's easier than maybe trying to put that into words. Fabian, how did you find that aspect of it, like the feedback and also corrections where necessary?
Yeah, that's the thing. With the written word, you can interpret it any which way. Whereas if you read someone's face while they deliver the news, it has a different impact. Thankfully, the drawing aspect is actually quite easy to solve, because we are drawing over. We have software where we're literally drawing over stuff in real time, and in that regard, it's actually handy to have the new softwares, because we're all sitting in the same meeting, and I don't have to crouch over someone's desk and draw there. So in that sense, it's good. Yeah, you know, there's pluses and minuses. Right now, we're just sort of figuring out what do we actually keep from that, and what do we drop. So one thing I don't miss is having to fight for crew rooms and trying to find rooms that are available and free and so on. So there are some positive aspects of it as well. But yeah, it's generally man management is a huge aspect of this as well, you know, because we're talking about retakes from a sort of technical point of view, but yeah, if you're together on a project for several years, the morale is a huge thing. So a lot of the times you also have to, you know, as supervisors, you're not only looking after how well the scene looks, but you also need to take into consideration, can I afford another retake? Or will this person, you know, what effect will that have that on that person? So there's a big chunk of that as well that deals with the human side of that.
For sure, yeah. And tell me now, at this point, the film has been released and it's now streaming on Netflix. And what happens now, the three of you, how does your assistant director's role play out now?
Well, so the funny thing is, once something is released, everybody has moved on a long, long time ago. So I finished on this pretty much a year ago. And so, yeah, everybody just is assigned, let's say, to different projects. So I'm co-directing the show now. And it's 78 episodes, and so we're just in the thick of it now. So in that sense, everybody just sort of, I think it's really important to take a break after every project. I wanted to highlight that as well. You know, in the past I used to think like, oh sure, I'll just roll into the next thing on Monday, but it's really, really important to clear your head for a couple of weeks, couple of months, recharge and so on. And yeah, now it's on to the next thing. So how about you guys, Louise?
Yeah, so I've even been a bit off the project even a bit longer than Fabian. So I actually finished on My Father's Dragon in towards the end of 2020. And so for me, that was because I was moving on to develop a feature film that I'm going to direct in Cartoon Saloon, that I'm just coming towards the end of development on it now. So that was like a real jumping into a new role again, in that sense. But also being assistant director on My Father's Dragon really did give me so much experience and so much understanding of the process, and you really can see how the sausage is made, you know, up close and personal. So for me, that was a really it was a really, you know, good way to go after My Father's Dragon, to step into this role as well. So yeah, for me, that's what I'm working on now, and I'll probably be working on it for another few years. Yeah. So Mark?
I actually can't say what I'm doing next. I'll be co-directing on something. Then they'll hopefully be. I'll hopefully be able to say that soon, but I can't just at the moment because of how these things work. But yeah, in the immediate, I was the one who left last, actually. So off us. I mean, I was the one who left My Father's Dragon last, and that was because I had to step in and do a lot of things up close with the comp department in the end. A lot of things just with getting all the storytelling right through framing and things like that. And that was very, very intense. So I took a long enough break immediately after that, when that was done, which I really needed. Yeah. So it depends. Say there's often obviously the director, and then sometimes, depending, writers, actors, and so on. Often we'll have this, like the second phase, the phase when the movie is finished, is like a promo phase, and like, say, Nora's doing that at the moment. Nora's around giving talks and everything like that. Depending on the project and the availability in different times. Say I did a lot of those for Nora for the Breadwinner. We did a bunch for Wolfwalkers, but like happily Nora just has a lot more time at the moment to be able to do it herself for My Father's Dragon. So the promo is falling more on her. But yeah, in a way, we do things like this. There's a lot of public outreach, a lot of just talking about it when you're done, which is no bad thing, because when you are working so intensely on something, you almost stop looking at it as this beautiful thing you can be proud of, because you're in the middle of it. You're just trying to get the next thing done. You're writing notes. You're trying to manage departments, everything like that. There's something really lovely about the kind of year or so after that's done, when you get to talk about it and watch it a bit and have people tell you what they think. And it can be very good for you to say, wow, we actually made something really beautiful there, because you can kind of forget about it otherwise. So yeah, it's a mirror image, I think.
I think it must feel a little strange when you're right in the thick of a new project, and also having to talk really coherently about the one that finished 6 months or a year ago. You need two brains sometimes. Anna has just messaged to say that she's got a number of questions for the panel. So Anna, we might bring you back in at this point and get to some of those.
Great. Now I've got about 4 questions from some people watching this talk, and I just have one that I wanted to pick up on, something that Louise said earlier. Animation as an art form involves so many people and is very much a team approach, but do most people aspire to develop and direct their own work? And if so, how hard is it to get to that stage? I wonder if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that it's a very personal decision, to be honest, if you want to become a director or not. I think it's great for everybody who's in animation to have a go, to see if they have it, or if it's interesting to them. I think it's not interesting. It's not what everybody wants to do. And that's absolutely valid. There's no one way to be in animation, and there's lots of different routes that are very satisfying. And I think you really have to, rather than thinking about it as being like, oh, I want to be the director because you get to be in charge. I think it's better to think about what you enjoy doing on your daily basis. What is it that you want? How do you want to spend your time if you're in animation? What do you want to be doing?
Yeah, I want to add to that as well, actually, because in many colleges it's all about what you put on your animation reel and so on. But I just want to stress there are so many ways into the industry. You can work in scene prep, you can work in layout. All these things are crucial. So, but sometimes it's not on the radar of people. That this is also a way in. So there's so many different entryways that can be used.
I would add to that as well that there's also accounting, legal, facilities management, HR, admin, like there's a whole range of positions and roles within the animation sector that don't actually require drawing ability.
Yeah, that's good. And as assistant director, do you need to facilitate, you need to facilitate all the departments, and while this involves myriad skills, I wonder, does it take a certain type of personality to do this job well?
I think it's always good if you like problem solving. Problem solving, I'd say, is something that you have to enjoy in some respect, because you'll be doing a lot of it if you're assistant director.
You have to like people. You have to like working with people, because it's all going to be that. If you're the, and that's actually a good line, I think, for people to like maybe know themselves there, because a lot of people who work in animation, they might be great with their friends and everything like that, but their ideal work day is just sitting down, head down, getting through scenes, working, and that's how they derive pleasure out of their work. When you go into supervising, then assistant directing and directing, that starts to disappear more and more, and it's replaced by human interaction. So you have to be happy with that. You have to want that, because the other stuff will go away a little. At least you'll hopefully be able to hold on to some of it, but it'll go away a little. So you have to like people.
And also, we also have one leg in production. So we have one leg in creative departments and one leg in production, meaning that you can make a scene nicer until the cows come home, but at some point it has to finish. And so you always have to bear that in mind as well. So it's a constant measuring up between what can we do, how can we plus it in the time that we have, and when to let go of it. There's this saying, a painting is never, or a film is never finished, it's just released. And you have to find that moment.
That's great. That's interesting insight. Let me move on to some of the questions. Grace Rabbit asked a question. My Father's Dragon, like other Cartoon Saloon films, deals with the child's perspective. How do you make their struggles and choices feel believable?
I think by not patronizing children. We try to treat them like, not maybe like adults, but not patronizing them as children. And I think that's huge. And children might not pick up on that consciously, but they will subconsciously.
Yeah, I think the other thing there for me as well is, when we're working on the story and we're thinking about the characters, we're working together as, quite collaboratively discussing, these things. And I think the other thing that people bring a lot is, if you think about your own life or think about things that happen to you, and everybody can contribute in terms of that. And that's real. That's talking about, it's not talking about something you saw in a film once. If you think about, if we bring our own experiences to the table, it helps to give things a bit more specificity and a bit more reality, because we know, this is life. This is the things that are infected us or were important to us. So I think that that's also one of the benefits of both having a lot of communication between a team, but also of being able to, think about that when you're looking at the characters. Think about what's real, and as Fabian says, think about how children are young people. They're not they have emotion and thoughts and complexity just as we as adults do. So
I think as well, I think children have a self-belief when they see children in films thrown into these very difficult situations. Adults look at it from an adult point of view and think, oh my God, what if my child was in that situation? You get very freaked out by it. Children are not looking at it that way. Children are thinking, yeah, I bet I could do the right thing. I bet I could do this. And that has to go hand in hand with, as Fabian says, not patronizing them, not making it that then they do everything perfectly and all that. But they have this self-belief. And I think if you can understand that, you should be able to represent something for them.
Great. Dermot Nolan asks, are storyboard and layout artists connected, and are they only brought in for pre-production, or can they be used somewhere else in the pipeline?
I can answer that if you like. So storyboard and layout are they are very linked because they're departments right next to each other. The storyboard is where you actually work out what shots you're doing, how you're doing them, and so on. Layout is where that's actually properly drawn and built, composed for the production. That said, you'd be surprised at how little, how rarely artists jump from one to the other, because if they were the same thing, they'd be the same thing. If you get me, like if they there wouldn't be two departments. So one is very much about working out the story through shots. The other is actually building the shots themselves. And then in terms of can they be used at other points in the production? That depends. You don't tend to have officially layout artists working again later in the production, but they're draftspeople. They're people who can draw, and they may have other skills. And so we have lots of people in the studio who have worked in layout and in other departments, but that's just because of their own particular skills and ability.
Great. And John Del Tanako asks, were there any, I'm sure there were, but were there any memorable moments you'd experienced in working on My Father's Dragon? Anything stand out?
I guess everybody has their own different moments. I know for some, it's also hearing the orchestra for the first time. For Giovanna Ferrari, who's head of story, for instance, I get the most satisfaction out of seeing a scene come to fruition, and we still have kept that through line of that initial spark. And despite many, many hands having touched it, it has retained its integrity. I find that very satisfying.
That's great. Gwen Fagan asked, as educators, we are aware of the importance of ensuring our students have strong soft skills as they transition to industry. From your perspective, is there anything you'd like to communicate to current students and recent graduates?
I think I was thinking about what you said there earlier, Mark. You mentioned that you have to want to, you have to enjoy working with people, and I think that goes into a lot of what's important, and what actually makes a huge difference. And working on a project like this is, and we've mentioned it before, we've touched on it in a few different ways, but like it is a collaborative process. It requires people to get on board with the vision of the director, of course, but it also it feeds up and down the chain essentially. So it's a two-way street, but it is important to be able to work with other people, but also to be able to communicate your needs or your things you might find challenging. So I think that is for me, communication and collaboration, being able to work as a team is a really important skill.
And being proactive. Don't just look at your own department, but think what your decision means for the next department. How does that influence their work? Think further than just your sort of niche. And if you have people like that on a team, it helps hugely.
And I would say in a word, it's empathy. Like I think empathy is the most in technical direction. Empathy is by far and away the most important skill, because it's the ability to say, well, wait a second, how is this situation going to look from the artist's eye view, the supervisor's eye view, the director's eye view, the line producer's eye view? How is this scenario going to look from each of those? And if somebody's behavior seems irrational or anything like that, just stop for a second and think what things look like from where they're standing. And that can be taught in school. I think in group projects, I really think people can have more empathy for the work that other people are doing at different times and other situations that people are in.
There's another question here from Victoria Viola Prioli. While watching the credits, she noticed there was a department dedicated only to shading characters. Is that something that is standard for most 2D animated films, or was that something unique to this project? She was also wondering if the characters were animated traditionally or with rigs.
So working in reverse, it's both. Mainly the characters were traditionally animated, but because there was a lot of textured elements, we also used a rigged software called Moho. And that was kind of what Fabian was referring to earlier, how complicated the pipeline was, that there were all these things happening on screen at once that needed to line up. The majority of the character animation the vast majority is hand-drawn, fully hand-drawn. And then there are some elements that are rigged in there. As for the department dedicated specifically to the shading of characters, the shading of characters, if that is part of your style, which it generally is in 2D animation, that you'll have at least one descriptive kind of shadow, that is a task that has to be done. And it depends. I think in Japan, it tends to be done by the same kind of assistant animators or whatever who are cleaning it up. We have in the past rolled that into the effects department. We had a specific department on it because we really wanted the whole movie's about faces, and the descriptiveness of how shadows fall on faces tells you so much. So we wanted a department and a supervisor who could kind of be dedicated to that. So it is and it isn't standard, if you.
Great. There's just one or two other questions. One, we'll have to wrap up in a moment, but Pam Araujo, was there a moment or moments in your paths when you clearly acknowledged you wanted to move on to assistant director, or did it just happen naturally based on your work choices? Kind of addressed some of that a little earlier, but anyone?
In my case, it happened more natural because I was working closely with departments that are related to that. Like we just sort of try to push the story, try to push the narrative, the performance of characters and so on. So departments that basically tied in nicely with what a director would do anyway.
Yeah, I think it's quite hard to know before you've done it whether if you're going to be the right fit in a way. I think that it's very project specific in terms of what a project might need from an assistant director. So it's hard to kind of like aim to be assistant director as a clear kind of career path. So for me, it was certainly something that was kind of a logical next step rather than something I had aimed for earlier in my career. But I think it does depend a little bit on what your own skill set is and your own interest, but also what the project is and who the director is and things like that, and how it would all work. For you, Mark?
Yeah, and just in my case, I would say that, like, I don't know if there are moments like I would say, oh, this project at this time, but certainly what I was saying about, that you need to like people and you need to like working with people. I realized every time I was given the job of having a team bring something and make something work, I enjoyed that process day to day, and I enjoyed the results far more than I liked being locked myself in front of something and building something. I do like doing that as well, but I realized I loved it so much. And then I realized when I was no longer looking after some artists and was instead looking after supervisors, each who were looking after artists, and they were in turn nurturing them and so on. And I realized how much I loved that. I just kind of knew directorial was the right place to be. I mean, assistant director is, as Louise, as you say, it's sometimes it's a logical next step. It's hard to know if it's what somebody wants to do for their whole career or not, though they may, because it can be really very rewarding. But I think if you realize you enjoy doing this, being with people as much, if not more, than you enjoy drawing or painting or whatever, then that's maybe a good sign on the compass, that maybe that is right for you. So yeah.
I think you all touched on some very interesting points. I don't know, Anne, do you have anything to close with, or should we move on?
No, just I guess a reminder to people out there about the talk series that's running, and also a reminder that you don't necessarily have to be able to draw to work in animation, though it does help. There are lots of different career paths and routes into working in the sector, so bear that in mind.
Yeah, thank you. The next talk is on Friday, the 9th of December, same time. So check out the website, butlergallery.ie, to register for that. And may I thank you, Anne, for posing some very interesting questions earlier. Thank you, Mark, Fabian, and Louise. Just very excited to see what's in the pipeline for all of you down the road. Very interesting projects I know that you're all working on. And thanks again to Animation SkillNet for funding these talks. So thank you to all the attendees. I hope you enjoyed and got some insight into the incredible art of animation. And we'll see you next time. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.